In today's episode of the Daily Brief, I'll talk about two interesting stories. I'll first talk about the age of electricity, and then I'll talk about how roads are built in India. Welcome back to the Daily Brief show by Zerodha, where our aim is to simplify the biggest news in the financial markets in a way that's one level deeper as compared to news channels. I'm your host Akshara, and today is Monday, 16th February. Coming to the first story. So, for most of modern history, the world's hunger for electricity has moved in lockstep with its economic growth. If an economy expanded, its power demand grew roughly in proportion, and the relationship was so consistent that it became an unspoken assumption. Electricity was a mirror of the broader economy. But that assumption is now broken. According to the International Energy or IEA's latest electricity outlook report, 2024 was the first normal year in 3 decades. That is, the first year without a major global crisis in which the world's electricity demand grew significantly faster than its economy. Now, the IEA doesn't think that this was a blip. Through 2030, in fact, it projects electricity consumption to grow at least 2.5 times faster than overall energy demand. Something fundamental has shifted. The world, it appears, is entering what the report calls an age of electricity, a period in which power demand is breaking away from the economy that was supposed to govern it. And this decoupling is already underway. Global electricity demand is expected to grow at an average of 3.6% a year through the end of the decade, almost 50% higher than its approximate 2.8% growth rate over the previous 10 years. In absolute terms, the world will add about 1,100 terawatt hours of new demand every year, roughly half of India's entire annual electricity consumption piled on top of existing demand every single year. We're living through a phase shift, and understanding why this is happening, what will power it, and what stands in the way tells you a great deal about where the global economy is headed. So think of what it means for electricity demand to outpace economic growth. Effectively, every year, every bit of economic activity we carry out is a little more electricity intensive than a year ago. Now, this is the outcome of two trends. The first is electrification, which is the replacement of other energy sources with electricity. There are things we're doing that create the same output as before, but we're turning to electrical power to do it. Activities that once ran on diesel, gas, or coal are increasingly powered by the grid. Transportation is the most visible example of this, with electrical vehicles steadily pushing out their ICE counterparts. We are making the same switch with industrial processes. Now, this doesn't necessarily make the economy bigger, but it makes it more electrified. The second is subtler. We are using electricity in ways that don't map neatly to productive output. Air conditioning is the clearest case. As incomes rise and temperatures climb across the developing world, hundreds of millions of people are plugging in cooling systems for the first time. And this represents a massive improvement in quality of life, but it doesn't show up directly in GDP figures, other than as demand for a single product. Predictably, over 80% of the world's new electricity consumption comes from the developing world. China alone accounts for nearly half of this growth, and in the next 5 years alone, it'll add demand equal to the European Union's entire current consumption. But India and Southeast Asia are growing rapidly too, and as they grow, there's a visible surge in air conditioning. So consider Uttar Pradesh. Whenever temperatures rise, you'd naturally expect some uptick in electricity demand as people try to cool down. But the sensitivity of demand to temperature, which is the surge in power consumed every time temperatures are up by 1 degree, has increased 5-fold since 2017. The use of air conditioners in the state clearly has exploded over the last decade. Interestingly, however, the developing world is no longer alone in driving consumption upward. After roughly 15 years of stagnation, electricity demand in advanced economies is accelerating as well. The catalyst here is computation. AI, data centers, and advanced manufacturing are pulling power demand upward across the United States and Europe. In the US alone, demand is projected to grow nearly 2% annually, with roughly half of that increase coming from data centers. So, if the world's electricity consumption is taking off at this rate, the obvious question is, how do we match it with supply? The answer, at least according to the IEA, is surprisingly optimistic. Low emission sources like renewables and nuclear are growing fast enough not just to meet all additional global demand, but to chip away at fossil fuels as well. By 2030, these are projected to account for half of all global electricity generation, up from around 42% today. The world is slated to add roughly 1,050 terawatt hours of renewable electricity alone for every remaining year of this decade, which is almost exactly how much new demand it expects to add. So, this is powered in great measure by a dramatic surge in solar energy. In 2025, the world added 620 terawatt hours of solar electricity in a single year, and it's on track to surpass both wind and nuclear generation by 2026 and hydropower by 2029, despite being the last of these sources to be deployed at any meaningful scale. In a decade, solar energy has gone from niche to dominant. There's also a less appreciated shift in nuclear energy. After years of sluggish growth, nuclear generation has suddenly taken off and is now projected to expand at 2.8% annually through 2030, more than double the pace of the preceding 5 years. As with so many energy trends, the engine here is China. Chinese nuclear generation is expected to grow at 6% per year, and given that the country consumes roughly one third of the world's energy, that ramp up is enough to lift the world's nuclear supply. On the other side of the ledger, meanwhile, fossil fuels are clearly losing ground. But that doesn't mean they're irrelevant. Coal will remain the single largest source of electricity globally in 2030. Natural gas, meanwhile, is positioned for an even longer runway. Gas fired electricity generation is set to grow at 2.6% annually, and it's become the world's preferred transitional source, complementing rather than competing with the intermittent output of renewables. In the aggregate, though, we are turning away from carbon intensive energy sources, and that's a quiet but historic development because carbon emissions now have decoupled from energy demand. Despite power demand growing by nearly 4% in 2025, the world's carbon emissions from electricity production practically didn't increase at all. So, for every unit of electricity generated, we're emitting a little less carbon each year, and the IEA projects what it calls a great plateau. Until 2030, carbon emissions from our power sector will remain flat even as demand ramps up. Now, here's the upshot of all of this. The world is seeing an explosion in its demand for electricity, matched by a historic surge in supply, at least on paper. But there's a problem. Between the power plants producing electricity and the factories, homes, and data centers consuming it, there's a vast, creaking network of transmission and distribution infrastructure. And this is turning out to be a terrible choke point. The world's power grids were not built for the energy system now taking shape. There's currently a backlog of over 2,500 gigawatts of projects, renewable generators, battery storage systems, data centers, and more that are simply stuck in grid connection queues waiting to be plugged in. And among these, 1,700 gigawatt of completed renewable projects sit in advanced stages of approval. Another 600 gigawatt of batteries are lined up behind them, and 150 gigawatt of data centers are waiting for connections, putting roughly a fifth of the world's planned data center build-out at risk of delay. Now, this is a self-reinforcing problem because getting a connection is so uncertain and slow, many developers submit speculative requests for projects that may never materialize, clogging the queue even further. The IEA estimates that only about 1 in 5 data centers currently seeking a grid connection will actually be built. But every speculative application takes up space in a line that real projects also need to join. All this hangs on a simple problem. Grids take ages to build, far longer than anything else in the energy system. Planning and constructing new transmission infrastructure takes anywhere from 5 to 15 years. Renewable power plants, by contrast, take 1 to 5 years. Data centers take 1 to 3. The grid, in other words, is the slowest moving piece in a system where everything else is accelerating. To meet projected 2030 demand, annual investment in grid infrastructure would need to rise by roughly 50% from current levels. So, what options do we then have if it isn't feasible to build power lines? The IEA thinks 1,200 to 1,600 gigawatt of projects currently stuck in queues can be unlocked without major new transmission lines. Part of the answer lies in regulatory innovation, and some countries have introduced ideas like non-firm connection agreements where projects can connect to the grid on the condition that they'll be cut off if the load exceeds what the system can handle. This kind of flexible arrangement could free up around 900 gigawatt of capacity globally. Another answer lies in what the industry calls grid enhancing technologies, upgrades to existing infrastructure that help it carry more power without being rebuilt from scratch. These alone could unlock a further 900 gigawatts. That said, our grid challenge isn't just about moving enough electricity through. As we transition to renewables, we're coming upon a new class of engineering problems. Fossil fuel plants are controllable. You can ramp them up and down to match demand in real time. But renewables, by their nature, are not. Solar output, for instance, surges at midday and vanishes at sunset. As these variable sources grow, the grid has to absorb far larger swings in supply, and it has to do so without losing stability. Now, that doesn't happen automatically, and the cost of a failure can be catastrophic. In April 2025, for instance, the entire electrical grid serving Spain and Portugal collapsed. There were several oscillations in supply which overwhelmed the region's grid infrastructure, and within half an hour, the entire system went dark. It took more than 12 hours to restore power. Failures like this become much more likely as the share of variable renewables grows. But this new generation of problems can be solved. Our current build out of battery storage, for instance, is an engineering response to a key problem with renewables. This transition will need a suite of new engineering solutions, from better forecasting to smarter demand management to grid architectures that can absorb volatility without breaking. So, in all, the IA's report is a sketch of a world caught in an inflection point, in the middle of a generational boom in both energy demand and supply. We're setting up new energy infrastructure at a blistering pace, while at the very same time, we're creating the most energy hungry technology we've ever seen. The world is moving faster than most people imagine. But a shift this big is never easy. Between supply and demand sits the grid, an aging, slow to build infrastructure layer that was designed for a different era. The coming decade will be shaped less by whether we can generate enough clean electricity and more by whether we can move it to where it's needed, when it's needed, without the whole system coming apart. The age of electricity has arrived. The infrastructure to support it has not. For all the sources mentioned in this video, don't forget to check out our newsletter. The link is in the description. Coming to the second story. So, we recently saw a headline that forced us to stop mid scroll. NHAI accepts RIIT's Rs 9,500 crore offer to monetize 5 highway sections. We could tell it was about road assets and monetizing them, but that's pretty much where our understanding ended. So, we did what any self respecting geek would do and went digging. And there was a lot of ground we had to first cover to understand that single sentence. How does India build roads? Where does the money come from? Who is responsible for what? And crucially, how do people make money in this whole chain? If you've read even a little about this, treat this as a quick revision. But if you're like us and had no clue how this world works, consider this a 101 primer. When you hear about the government building roads, behind the scenes, there's a relay race. Money, permissions, and responsibility keep getting passed from one hand to another. To keep it simple, let's stick to national highways or NH. The big interstate corridors you see with NH numbers. These are managed by the central government, even though they physically run through the states. So the story kicks off every year with the union budget. This sets the overall outlay for roads and highways, what will be spent on new roads and for maintaining existing ones. That number in practice becomes the ceiling for how much fresh construction can be pushed. Now, the budget isn't the only source of money. There are tolls, obviously, though most of that is used for either maintaining existing roads or servicing debt. Government agencies like NHAI can also theoretically take loans, but that stopped in 2023. So, if you want to go beyond what the budget permits, the only other route left is project-based financing and monetization through InvITs. Over time, such monetization has become a major part of the government's plan, making up roughly 7% of the funds going into road development. And it's a sleeping giant, never enough on its own, but important support if India wants to build more roads within its budget. Now, the budget sets broad expectations, but the actual check writing happens at the ministry. The Ministry of Road Transport and Highways, or MORTH, is the policy boss, the parent ministry responsible for the whole machine. So when you hear big claims in the budget speech about thousands of crores being set aside for roads, look closer and you will see that money being allocated to MORTH. Now there's a lot that MORTH does. At a high level, it decides which corridors matter and what projects get fast-tracked. Then it approves specific projects and the framework around them, the contracting model being used, the broad rules of tolling and concessions, and so on. And finally, it controls how the money promised is actually released and spent. So, MORTH, in short, is the policy brain taking key decisions. But it doesn't actually build roads. The job of execution goes to the National Highways Authority of India, or NHAI. So, NHAI takes the ministry's vision and turns it into actual projects, packaging them into tenders. So, what begins as a big highway plan is broken now into smaller stretches with granular plans and clear timelines. Then, NHAI runs a bidding process to select contractors. And as the road is built, it supervises the work, checking quality, monitoring milestones, and making payments. Now, while national highways are a central subject, state governments have power over the physical land they pass through. They inevitably get pulled into the process, handling land acquisition and permissions for shifting utilities like power lines, water pipes, telecom, and other messy stuff. And there's a mountain of other coordination: environment and forest clearances, railway crossing approvals, permissions around water bodies or coastal zones, and so on. Nothing moves without all of this being handled. Finally comes the actual physical construction of work, which is often handled by a private contractor. Often, at least for national highways, infrastructure companies take up EPC, or engineering procurement construction contracts, or contracts of other sorts. We'll get to those soon. So, even once the road is built, the job isn't over. It needs maintenance and a solid command over operations like toll collection. That's why multiple models exist, and that's where the monetization question we began with shows up. You could think of every new highway project as one blunt question: who puts money in first and who earns later? That decides the model under which the road is built and later maintained. Let's start with the simplest, where the government via NHAI says we want this road built. It then invites bids from contractors. The contractor builds it, gets paid for reaching milestones, and then exits once the defect liability period is over. All this while the road is fully under NHAI or government control. It's convenient with fewer moving parts, and with control, quality is easier to enforce. But there's a brutal downside. In such contracts, the government or NHAI takes the money risk upfront. It shells money out regardless of what future traffic and toll collections look like. And that's fine in theory. Roads aren't businesses meant for toll revenue, they're public goods. But that shrinks how much the government can do. A large chunk of cash gets locked up front, and as a result, you end up building fewer roads with the same budget because money becomes the bottleneck. And that money only comes back later from tolls and more broadly from its wider economic spillover. At the other end, the contractor takes on execution risk. Can they build the road on time, to spec, without messing up? Their payments depend on hitting those milestones. The cheaper they can do so, the better the margin they can earn. Companies like Larsen & Toubro or L&T, Dilip Buildcon or DBL, and GR Infra Projects have built big businesses around this. Now, if NHAI doesn't want to lock all that money up, it can ask private developers to build a road with their own money and then operate and maintain it for some time, usually 15 to 20 years. As compensation, the developer gets the right to collect tolls for that time. And the road is only handed to the government after that. So, in short, the private player takes both the money risk and the execution risk and earns it back through tolls over a period. Now, this is convenient for a government because it avoids heavy spending, so you can build more roads faster without the budget choking the system. But on the flip side, it's a tricky deal for a private player. Their revenue is tied to future traffic and tolls, which aren't guaranteed. If traffic doesn't show up as expected, those toll collections don't show up either. Those risks could appear for any reason: alternate roads or expressways opening nearby, changes in toll rules, an expansion of exemptions, and so on. Since the government isn't taking toll collection risk here, it doesn't feel the pain of shifting policy. The private player does. Neither option is perfect. The government doesn't want to spend large sums of money, but private players think very hard before taking on government scale risk. And so, in between is the HAM model, which splits the burden. So, in this mode, the government through NHAI pays a portion of 40% during construction while the developer funds the rest. That is, both put money in upfront. Once the road is built, tolls are collected by the NHAI or the government. The developer gets paid back through fixed annuity payments from NHAI over many years while operating and maintaining the road during that period. The payment is guaranteed by NHAI, subject to performance. Now, here, the developer's return isn't a bet on traffic. If they can build the road properly without delays and maintain it well, they keep getting a predictable check from NHAI. To the government, this has some of the downsides of standard EPC contracts, even if in dilute form. It pays some money upfront, and in exchange, it does get a live asset which throws off cash for decades through tolls. But the cash comes in slowly over time. Until then, that is capital which is locked up and can't be put into more roads. So the government gets creative. It tries to pull future toll cash forward into today's money. And that's basically the backbone of its asset monetization plan. In the TOT model, an operator pays NHAI a lump sum upfront and in exchange gets the right to collect tolls for 20 to 30 years. They also take on full maintenance obligations for that period. Now, unlike everything we've spoken about so far, these contracts draw private capital into managing completed assets, not building them. The road already exists and it's only being monetized. That gives the government money upfront to redeploy elsewhere while the operator gets a stream of future cash flows. Here, the operator bears the risk of both maintaining the road and collecting the tolls. It can subcontract the work, sure, but in the end, the operator is on the hook for the road staying in shape and the numbers working out. Another is doing the same thing through InvITs or infrastructure investment trusts. That's essentially the same idea but in a fancier wrapper. In an InvIT transaction, the project company holding the tolling rights to road assets are transferred into a trust, and the trust raises money by issuing units to investors. From that point on, the toll income belongs to the trust and to its unit holders. Essentially, in such a construct, future toll cash flows are packaged and sold to investors, and that's where the government gets its liquidity. And this is pretty much what's happening with the RIIT deal. So NHAI sponsored an InvIT called RIIT. RIIT won the right to collect tolls on and maintain 5 highway stretches. In return, it agreed to pay NHAI rupees 9,500 crore. Now RIIT gets those tolling rights for the 5 stretches. And to pay for this, RIIT is raising money, some equity, some debt. It also plans to IPO in February. So NHAI gets cash today, investors get a claim on toll cash flows tomorrow. RIIT functionally becomes a financing vehicle for NHAI while tolling and maintenance continue without NHAI needing to run the asset directly. It's a win-win for everyone. Now coming to the tidbits. India's retail inflation stood at 2.75% in January 2026 under the new 2024 base CPI series. Food inflation rose 2.13%, ending months of decline mainly due to a sharp jump in tomato prices, while core inflation eased to 3.4%. Economists expect inflation to rise slightly in the coming months but remain within RBI's 2 to 6% target band. Coming to the next tidbit. Rolls-Royce said it will scale up operations in India, exploring co-development of a next-generation 120 kilonewton combat jet engine with full technology transfer and IP ownership for India. The company is also looking at partnerships to localize engine manufacturing for the Army, Navy, and Coast Guard, aiming to boost jobs and domestic capabilities. Now coming to the final tidbit. The government conducted a bond switch with the RBI, buying back over Rs 75,500 crore of securities maturing in FY27 and issuing a longer-term 8.3% GS 2040 bond instead. The move helps spread out repayments, reduce rollover risk, and smoothen the center's debt maturity profile among heavy upcoming redemptions. That's all the news I have for you. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next one.
Disclaimer: this content is for informational purposes only. None of the stocks, brands, or products mentioned are recommendations or endorsements.